The ontological argument. This is a series of video podcasts summarising some of the classical arguments for the existence of God, included in the OCR AS specification for religious studies, philosophy of religion. The aim is to be both concise and reasonably comprehensive, and the video should be a useful aid for revision. The material is not, however, intended to replace the detailed notes and reading connected with and required for this course. The ontological argument for the existence of God was famously set out by the 11th century Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, in his Proslogion, chapters 2 to 4. His argument is essentially a reflection on the nature of God by someone who already believes in God, though it does raise some interesting philosophical questions along the way. It's an example of what today we might call a thought experiment. It is a priori, that is, it starts not with sense experience but with a concept of God. It then proceeds by unpacking that concept and carefully examining its contents. Anselm establishes his conclusion that God exists by means of a reductio ad absurdum. He defines God as a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. If this God only existed in the mind, however, then a greater being than God could be imagined to exist in reality. This real God would then be greater than God, which is clearly absurd. So, he reasons, God cannot exist only in the mind. Now, this argument may have established God's existence, but for God to be God, there must be more to God than this. Otherwise, God would just be one entity among many others. To raise God above mere entities, Anselm must argue that God's existence is very special, or necessary, which means that, unlike things that just happen to exist, contingent things, God could not exist. To prove this, he refers us back to his definition of God as a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. And using the same procedure as before, that is a reductio, argues that God's existence must be necessary, because a God existing only contingently would not be the greatest possible being. Some statements have their predicates contained in the subject. For example, in all married people have partners, having a partner is part of the concept of being married. These statements or propositions are called analytic because as soon as you've broken them down into their constituent parts or analysed them, you can see immediately that they are true. Conversely, if you break down a statement and don't know whether it's true without having to go out and check, the statement is synthetic. For example, the population of Mumbai is 10 million. One puzzling or confusing thing about the ontological argument is that Anselm states that God exists is an analytic truth, or more precisely, an analytic existential truth. If you break open God, you find existence, as well as other properties. In the second part of this presentation, we will consider briefly the views of several philosophers who have responded in different ways to the ontological argument. Descartes, 1596 to 1650, needed God to exist to guarantee the certainty of the existence of the external world. God's existence is established a priori by asserting that God has all the perfections and that existence is a perfection. Therefore God exists. Existence is no more foreign to God than the sum of the internal angles of a triangle being 180 degrees is foreign to the nature of a triangle. More recently, D.Z. Phillips has argued that the key to understanding the ontological argument is an appreciation of the unique sense of God that Anselm tries to express. For Anselm, God is a unique concept with a unique grammar, and it's a mistake to interpret God exists in the same way as a table exists. God exists is not a common garden existential assertion. Rather, it is an affirmation about the nature of reality at the deepest level. The full meaning and implications of this can only be experienced by a person of faith. A contemporary of Anselm who criticized the ontological argument was the monk Gaunilo. Gaunilo maintained that Anselm's argument would allow him to assert that the most perfect island would have to exist, since an island in the mind was less perfect than an island in reality. Anselm countered this by saying that, unlike an island, God was not a contingent thing, but a non-contingent or necessary one, and that an imaginary but not real necessary being was a contradiction. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, objected to Anselm's argument simply on the grounds that for many ordinary intelligent people, God's existence is not self-evident, in the way that an a priori argument suggested. Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, rejected Anselm's argument because he believed that he could demonstrate that existence was not an attribute like omnipotence or omniscience. To add existence to a concept, the unicorn exists, means that the concept is instantiated. There is something corresponding to that concept in the world. This is an empirical claim that can only be settled by going into the world and checking to see if it's true. Even if there is a unicorn somewhere, however, the concept would remain exactly the same. Existence would add nothing to it. So you can't unpack God and find existence in that concept. People come to the ontological argument with certain assumptions about God, including the assumption that God is a being alongside other beings, and this generates many of the difficulties that are associated with the argument. Once this assumption is challenged, however, this and some of the other arguments for God's existence can be seen in a different light. The difficulty, of course, is to explain a God that is not modelled on the idea of thinghood.